Stop. Okay. Everybody shut up. Welcome to Our Professor Podcast. I'm Micah.
I'm Sander.
And today we are talking about Professor Ebert. Professor Christopher Ebert is a historian of Latin American history from an Atlantic perspective. He received his PhD from Columbia University. His research has focused on colonial Brazil and Portuguese Atlantic expansion, including trade and shipping. He has also studied Dutch trade and Atlantic expansion. He is the author of Between Empires, Brazilian Sugar in the Early Atlantic Economy, 1550 to 1630, and is now completing a book manuscript based on research in Europe and Brazil on the social and economic history of Salvador da Bahia, Brazil's first colonial capital. We have a wonderful student guest with us today, Mr. Dave Mounier, also known as Mr. Mango, colloquially. Dave, what is it like taking a class with Professor Ebert?
Honestly, it's pretty relaxed. I mean, I'm just gonna jump right into it. So this is one thing that he does that I love about Professor Ebert. He'll straight up admit when he's not sure about something, or he just straight up doesn't know about something. Like he'll straight up admit it, which I appreciate that, because from my experience at my old university, a lot of professors, they won't do that. They won't admit to their faults or failings when it comes to knowledge. But Professor Ebert, he's just straight with it. He's just like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. Or he'll just be straight up like, yeah, you're gonna have to check the book with that one. And honestly, I appreciate that. But at the same time, that's not to say that he's not knowledgeable either. He's a very knowledgeable guy. I mean, the dude's like an encyclopedia when it comes to Brazil and Portugal. It's insane, really. Like, he just knows so much. Obviously, that being said, naturally, a lot of his classes focus, at the very least, partially on Brazil, if not Portugal. But just because he's so specific with his realm of knowledge doesn't make it any less valuable. It's astounding, really. I mean, he even has command of the language of Portuguese as well. So it's like he's able to get to a level with his knowledge that you normally wouldn't be able to if you were, say, an American, studying a foreign source of knowledge and whatnot. So I gotta say, it's pretty it's a nice mix of both being very rich and relaxing.
And how would you describe the course load and the amount of material you would go over in a typical class with Professor Ebert?
Super fair. So I'm currently taking political and economic history of Brazil and Mexico from the 19th century to the present. And basically the way he's doing it is he introduced both countries at the very, very start of the course. And now we're covering Brazil for the first half of the course. And then the second half of the course is then going to be Mexico. So he's got like this. And then at the end, we're going to basically synthesize the two and just sort of go over their present day issues and developments and whatnot. I mean, in the coursework, it like the load is perfectly fair. Like, he gives us a quiz and a response paper. He doesn't demand too much. He's like, just give me a page or two on a primary source relating to the course material, which that's another great thing about Ebert. He does a great job at selecting primary sources that really illuminate and directly connect to whatever it is that we're learning about at any given instance throughout the course, right? And then I know we have a paper coming up for the midterm, and then we're supposed to have a final paper. The midterm paper is going to be about Brazil. The final paper is going to be about Mexico. So it's like it's nice, and it's basically nice and even. He's got this nice and even balance going. He's got enough time dedicated to both countries. He might seem a little disorganized at times, but it all comes together. It all comes together, and it comes together very neatly and very beautifully.
Well, those are some really fantastic words about Professor Ebert. Thank you so much, Dave, for coming here. I say that we dilly nor dally no further. We get right to hearing from our main guest. Please welcome Professor Christopher Ebert. And the crowd goes nuts.
Ballistic.
We're just going to start really simply. How did you get into your area of study?
Thank you, Micah and Carter, for inviting me and for letting me talk about this. I appreciate it. I lived in Portugal prior to starting an academic career. Actually, prior to finishing college, I was a returnee. I'd done some part of my undergraduate degree, and then I worked, and during my work career, which was in a variety of things, mostly more working class type jobs, I did end up moving to Portugal. I lived there for 3.5 years, starting in 1990, and I did a few different jobs while I was there. I learned Portuguese, and I had always been very interested in history. I had been reading history very seriously through all of my adult life, and I became interested in Portuguese history, and that includes Portugal's long and intimate relationship with its colony, Brazil. So when I came back from Portugal at the end of 1993, I decided in the spring that I would finish my undergraduate degree, which was my concentration was in ancient history. I then went straight to Columbia. I applied to a variety of schools for a doctorate. I was accepted at a few, and I picked Columbia. I worked with a very famous Latin American historian and economic historian, Herbert Klein, and we had spoken right away as I started there about what I might be interested in studying. And at that point I spoke Portuguese and German, and he said, well, you could learn Dutch and do something about the Dutch in Brazil, because the Dutch invaded Brazil, rather the Dutch West India Company invaded the Brazil in 1624 and then again in 1630, and after 1630 they actually managed to set up a kind of a colony there for about 24 years before they were decisively booted out. And so that's an area that has invited a lot of historical attention, both among Dutch and Portuguese and American scholars. So in fact, as soon as I studied at Columbia, I hastened to learn Dutch, which is not that different from a German. It gives you an advantage if you speak German, and decided that I would focus on some aspect of Dutch, Portuguese, Brazilian interactions, and with an economics history focus, which was the specialty of my advisor. So that's how it all came about, and my first works, including my book and several articles, had to do with this we call transnational or inter-imperial relations, economic relationships between the Dutch Republic, the Kingdom of Portugal, and Portugal's colony in Brazil. And then I subsequently, when I was kind of winding down that project, thought I would look a little more closely at something that was more specifically colonial Brazil. And Salvador da Bahia had been the capital of colonial Brazil for about 200 years, starting in the middle of the 16th century. And it became apparent to me that nobody had really ever written a comprehensive history of Salvador da Bahia. So this was a project that I started just after, I would say more around 2007, 2008, I started pursuing this. And I started to realize that this was a really big project, and partly because nobody had done it before, but also that Salvador da Bahia was a super connected place. It was a hub of early modern globalization. And so I began doing archival research in the National Archives in Great Britain, in Portuguese archives, Brazilian archives, and Dutch archives to look at some of these connections that made Salvador da Bahia a hub in early modern globalization. And then at some point, about 5 or 6 years ago, I took on a research partner who was Tiago Krause from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I had known him from the time he was doing a master's thesis. I'd met him in Brazil, and we had been in close communication because he was a specialist on Salvador da Bahia, looking at completely different aspects of the city, but highly complementary to the work that I was doing. And he very fortunately agreed to be my research partner. So we have been working together on this project, which in fact does seem still seems a bit daunting, but that became that's the trajectory of my interest in the project. And again, Salvador da Bahia is sometimes a city in Brazil is known as Bahia, often it's known as Salvador. In the colonial period, it was usually referred to as Salvador da Bahia, so that's the title. And it's the city itself that we study. The previous work on it has been more about the productive countryside, because the city itself was a global hub with a lot of service industries, financial, logistical, etc. And it was also an administrative center of the Portuguese Empire. But it also was the city that processed and distributed the produce of its hinterland, which was a vast, very rich area producing initially sugar and then tobacco in the period that we study it as well too. So it was a big behemoth of colonial production as well. And that aspect had been studied by historians, including the very famous historian Stuart Schwartz of Yale. But the role of the city itself and the sort of urban aspects of Bahia had been neglected.
This research project that you're doing, it's 15 years of global research. It's 48 archives in 11 countries, consulting manuscript sources in 9 different languages, and you have more international trips planned for this, right? What does it take to do something like this, such a long project, and how do you compress so much information? If you could talk a little bit more about that process.
Some of these don't have an answer. This is stuff we're grappling with. How to put all of this detail into a reasonably digestible form. And as with everybody who does an academic work, we have to think about who we want our audience to be, how comprehensive we want to be, and these are things we're really dealing with right now. We have preliminary relationships with 2 publishing houses, academic publishing houses, one in Brazil and one here. I won't mention which one because it's not official yet, but our goal, of course, is to get editorial support that will allow us to create some sort of vision about who our audience will be and what level of detail we should include. So it is in fact daunting. Why this broad reach? Well, Salvador was the most important place in the 16th, 17th, and the middle of the 18th century in the South Atlantic, bar none. And it was on everybody's lips in Europe and in Africa, and increasingly in the Portuguese networks of trade in the Indian Ocean as well too, and in East Asia. There's information about Salvador in archives all over the place. And the Brazilian, Portuguese, and American, and other scholars from other places that have studied it before, and in general have studied colonial Brazil, have often failed to escape what Professor Krause calls methodological nationalism, which is to say they failed to look in archives that were outside of the language group. So they were missing a lot of parts of the story. So this was something that we wanted to address. And you start to find out a lot more about a place when you look outside of the imperial archives that are the obvious place to start to look at. The records from the various councils, and in the case of Salvador, there were several at various times that were important for it, but especially the Overseas Council based in Lisbon that generated huge amounts of documentation, or another important one, the Board of Tobacco, which operated a tobacco monopoly which benefited the Portuguese crown starting in the second half of the 17th century. So these are obvious places, but then you find out if you go to the archives of the Dutch Republic, for example, the West India Archives, Dutch West India Archives, the Second West India Company, which had very intimate relations with Portuguese merchants in the various parts of the coast of West Africa. They were locked in a very delicate dance of cooperation and competition. And so there's quite a lot of information in those archives, so that's worth looking at. The British were the most important trading partner with Portugal. They traded for Brazilian commodities indirectly through Lisbon. They had a huge merchant community known as a factory in Lisbon. So reading that material is important. We're going to Genoa because Brazilian commodities that went to Lisbon tended, after the rise of Caribbean production, they tended to go to Mediterranean destinations, and one of the biggest brokers were Genoese merchant houses. So they're constantly writing about Salvador and about Bahia. And that was also true with Barcelona. So we're going there as well too to look at various kinds of records, including freight contracts, notarial records, getting down into the nitty-gritty of strategies of ships captains who were carrying commodities and that sort of stuff. There are French governmental archives because the French were also intimately interested in Brazilian produce. At one point, early on, they were big buyers of Bahian tobacco. Bahia just figured largely in the kind of relationship between early modern European states. It was a big issue for various reasons. And some of it also had to do with the discovery of gold in Minas Gerais, which was not close to Salvador. This happened around 1700. But gold was then moved from Minas Gerais to the coast in an interior road to Salvador. And Salvador is one of the cities that minted it and then distributed it back to Portugal and across the Atlantic world. So for various reasons, Salvador loomed large. And it was also a big seaport with a ship repair yard. So ships coming from the French Empire, from the British Empire, and from the Dutch Republic would, if they were in needed emergency repairs, often ended up in Salvador as well, either coming from the Indian Ocean or going to Africa or going to other parts of South America as well. So it was a place that a lot of ships ended up in as well. And they often were trying to engage in contraband trade and that sort of stuff. Salvador basically shows up everywhere. So we thought, let's look at all of this stuff. Now, have we gone to all of these archives in person? Do we speak all of the languages that we're interrogating? Well, yes and no. Between Professor Krause and I, we do have most of the languages covered. He's a French speaker, which I'm not. I can do German, Dutch, Portuguese. We both are okay with reading Spanish sources and have done so pretty extensively. And, you know, with Italian, neither of us are super trained in Italian paleography, but we also rely on other people to help us out, other scholars who work in these areas as well. I guess the other important thing to say is that when I first started studying colonial Brazil, archival visits were absolutely necessary. You had to go to archives. And there has been a great revolution since that time, which is to say digitalization of archival sources. So much of this can be done from the comfort of one's living room in Rio de Janeiro or Brooklyn, or in my case, North Bergen, New Jersey as well too. And it's really extraordinary the progress that some places have made on digitizing their archival sources. I mean, for stuff pertaining to the Dutch Republic, it's really extraordinary. So much has been digitized. Portuguese have digitized really large parts of their archives as well too, various ones. The Spanish, so-so. I would say most people I know work in Spanish colonial archives are a bit frustrated with access and with the level of digitalization. But it certainly has gotten better. So there you go. I mean, a lot of this work can just be done. This kind of broad reach can be facilitated without massive amounts of travel. Of course, one doesn't mind the travel, but it takes time and it's expensive. I've been fortunate to get good grants from various sources via CUNY as well too. So,
I mean, even with the digitalized archives, it's still absolutely fascinating to me, this project that you're working on. I think it's so cool, and I really want to see it when it's done. I just think just the investigative work of sort of turning over every stone all over the world, that's so interesting to me.
Yeah, and you do end up with mounds and mounds of interesting tidbits and stories and huge amounts of data, and that's the challenge right now is what are we going to use? You can't just reproduce your research results because yawn. Who wants to read that? I mean, who has the time? I would say one legacy of this project is that we will leave, we have already a gigantic database of digitalized primary sources that we will be sharing with scholars that come. There's room for 100, 200 dissertations just in the stuff that we've gathered, if there's interest in it. And Professor Krause in particular, he teaches in a Brazilian university. He's got lots of master students working on various aspects of it as well too. An MA in a Brazilian university is probably somewhere between an MA thesis and a US institution and a PhD dissertation. It's a little more of a complicated and a little more research intensive endeavor. So yeah, there will be a dedicated database of sources available to people.
Oh, this is a massive contribution to your specific field, but I think just to history in general. It's so cool.
Professor Krause is a machine for collecting these things, and he's very networked as well too, so we get people sending us stuff and contributing. But yeah, we have a Dropbox section which is just bulging with information. But again, getting through all of this and distilling it in a narrative, ultimately you have to tell a story, right? In history, even if it's geeky economic history, you have to tell a story. So otherwise nobody will read it. And we want to pitch it at least to a book that would be accessible to undergraduates. Maybe be a book that of which chapters are assigned, right? But we would like to. I really feel strongly that we have a duty to write relatively accessible stuff, not necessarily popular history. And to be honest, the work in Portuguese on colonial Brazilian history is not very accessible, not even to Brazilian undergraduates. It tends to be a little bit too erudite and a little bit too specialized. I think it'll be important work, both in the Portuguese and the English edition.
One thing that's piqued
Hold
my...
on a second.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to get some more coffee in me. Something's got to keep those synapses from firing.
You know a lot of languages. You know Portuguese, Dutch, German. You're speaking to us in English right now. You can read Spanish. As someone who struggles with learning new languages, that's extremely impressive. And to do higher education level work in those languages is doubly impressive. Can you talk a little bit about the process of learning these languages, as well as like how you use your education and your knowledge of these languages in your own teaching?
Sure. Well, I capitalized on life experiences. I, in common with most Americans, grew up with very poor language training in high school. I did take a couple of years of German in high school, which doesn't get you anywhere close to fluency, and German's not the easiest language. I was determined to get as far away as I could when I graduated from high school, and so I went on a high school exchange program to Germany at the age of 18. And I spent a year in Hanover, Germany, and that was a sink or swim situation. I was at a high school, I was with a family, I was immersed, and at that point you learn the language pretty handily. I think very few people come away from those programs without developing decent fluency. So I had German. Portuguese came a little more slowly. I was 30 when I started learning it, living in the country. I was less systematic about learning it, but eventually it came. And I'd like to say fluency is not a moment in time. It's a process. I still take Portuguese classes. I spent my free time during the pandemic taking one-on-one language courses on the internet to improve, because I feel like you can always learn more, you can always be better. It's not a super easy language. Reading is one thing, you can always use a dictionary, you can always ask people, but just to keep it going. And Dutch also was something I studied formally at Columbia University as well too. And there again, hadn't been using Dutch sources for a while as I was focusing on Portuguese sources. And I recently got back into using Dutch sources again, and you forget things, but that's why we have dictionaries, and there are even specialized dictionaries, and sometimes you have to refresh your knowledge of paleography as well too. That's something that we deal with because our sources are not printed, they're handwritten. Some forms of the handwriting are really miserable to read, some are relatively easy. So that's something I've taken courses at various times. Sometimes it's just been sink or swim, learning to decipher abbreviations and styles of handwriting from previous times. But little by little, you develop that body of knowledge. It's scary when you start out. It's very intimidating, and you just have to plug away at it. And sometimes some PhD programs offer really formalized training in it. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're workshops. I was fortunate at Columbia because it is one of the few universities that offers Dutch instruction and also paleography courses as well. There's very little instruction in the United States in Dutch. It's not a sought-after language, so yeah, it's a process, and sometimes you need to network to make it happen as well too. But it was life experience, really. I had at least 2 before I even finished my undergraduate degree, and that was from living in Europe. So I decided I could capitalize on that, and that was something that informed my research choices as well too. So go abroad, go abroad, go for as long as you can. That's how you learn a language. But there's no solution. People say, oh, you're good with languages. I say, no, it's work. It's work, especially for an adult learner. There's no shortcut.
I want to move it a bit to talking about the classroom and just your classes. Do you have a single approach to teaching every class, or does it change with each one of your classes? Essentially, what can a student look forward to coming into one of your classes?
I don't think I'm a paragon of pedagogy. I say that especially because I hear people talk about what they do in the classroom, and I see people put it into practice, and sometimes I feel that I am inferior to other people who are doing really amazing things. But I also have to decide what works for me and try to gauge what's happening in the classroom to see if that works as well. I start with the assumption that if I just talk for unbroken periods of time, that there's going to be a limited ability for people to pay attention to that. And that's all supported by research. So you have to do something to break it up. So one of my classic approaches is to be somewhat interactive in the course of a lecture. I may mostly be lecturing, but you probably know if you've taken my course that I often will stop to pose a question, and that breaks it up, wakes people up a little bit. So that, at the very least, I don't know if that's Socratic method or whatever, I try to break things up. I incorporate more formal discussions in small groups, show little multimedia snippets. That's my basic philosophy, just try to engage when people are tuning out. That's what I do. I can't say it's anything fancier than that. I try to see what's going on in the classroom and also to turn it back to the students as much as possible. I mean, I am capable of talking for a very long period of time without interruption. But is that what works in the classroom? No.
I'll say that whatever you're doing seems to be working because your courses are popular.
Oh, well, thank you.
So you're a member of the Dessau choirs, which is one of the top courses in New York City. You perform choral work from the Renaissance up to today and doing outreach promoting this art form. How did you get involved with that organization, and what has it meant to you personally?
Well, I have a lot of hobbies outside of teaching. I'm not a one-trick pony. These are various interests I've had throughout my adult life, and in some cases even from before. I grew up in a pretty musical family. I was involved in singing in church from the time I was a little kid. My family was quite religious. I'm not a religious person now, but I grew up in a religious family. I had also started playing the violin in the 3rd grade and developed pretty independently from my family a strong interest in classical music by the time I was in junior high school. And I started singing and training my voice in my last years of high school. So I took a lot of years of private lessons, in my 20s mostly, and then recently I've returned to them. I dropped the violin, but I started singing in choirs in the 1980s. And I sang with a few of them, and one season with the Amateur Light Opera Company as well too. Did some solo singing, not for profit. I never thought I had an instrument for doing it professionally, but I always loved to sing. And then I kind of lost track of it for a long time. I stopped singing with any chorus. I mean, I would sing for fun and pleasure, just, in the shower or whatever, inflicting my repertoire on whomever was sitting around me in various cases. Parties, sometimes, karaoke, that sort of thing. But I wasn't really doing anything formally for quite a long time. And a friend of mine, a really old friend of mine from high school, still a dear friend of mine, was getting married. And she said, "Will you sing at my wedding?" And I said, "Sure." And then I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do now? And I spoke to the then chair of the music department and director of the conservatory at Brooklyn College. And she put me in touch with a new professor there, Professor Malcolm Merriweather, who had just started running the vocal programs in the conservatory. And he very kindly offered to give me some lessons to get me ready for this concert. And then after a few lessons, he said, "I am also directing an amateur choir, which was the West Village Chorale, and will you sing with them?" And I said, "Okay, let's do this." So I started singing with them, and then he moved very quickly to Dessau, which is a really good amateur chorus that's turning 100 in a year. His career has been spectacular. He's now the choral director for the New York Philharmonic as well, too, but still running Dessau. And so I auditioned for that. I got in. I'm a tenor, which gives you some pull because there are always not enough tenors. There are never enough tenors. So yeah, I've been doing that ever since with a great deal of pleasure. And under his leadership, it's really become a very exciting ensemble. He's been championing the work of African-American composers, including most recently Margaret Bonds, who was a Harlem Renaissance figure and a big collaborator with Langston Hughes and wrote some beautiful choral music and art songs and various other types of music as well too, and was kind of forgotten because, a woman and two, African American, right? But so Professor Merriweather with some other collaborators has been working to bring her back, and we've just released a CD which you can stream on any of the streaming applications. It's two of her choral works. One is called Credo, with a text by W.B. Du Bois. Fantastic anti-racist, anti-imperialist text from the beginning of the 20th century. And then another piece which is called Simon Bore the Cross, which is an oratorio. It's a religious oratorio with a text by Langston Hughes, and it is an attempt to bring some diversity and inclusion into the story of the Passion of Christ by focusing on one of the figures mentioned in a couple of the Gospels, Simon the Cyrene, who, according to these narratives, bore the cross. So it sort of brings in a popular religious approach with an African character that's centered in that narrative as well. And it's very pastiche. It has music from all of the sort of modernist trends of the 20th century and also spirituals. A really great piece. You can stream it. Margaret Bonds, Dessau Choirs, Simon Bore the Cross, and the Credo. It's a really nice recording, just out. That's my ad.
That's very cool. I love the plug. I love having the plug here. Besides your current research on Salvador da Bahia, are there anything else on the horizon, or new classes or side things that you're interested in?
Well, I decided to focus on the indigenous history that's embedded in colonial and modern Latin America. So I have developed a course in indigenous history, which I'll teach for the first time in the fall, which will look at probably three groups. It's a big story because there's so many different polities and ethnicities within indigenous history in North and South America. I'll focus on the so-called Mexica, sometimes known as the Aztecs, before and after the conquest. I'll focus on Andean polities, including the so-called Inca, which were actually just an imperial group presiding over a very large number of ethnicities and languages. And I'll also look at Guarani-speaking indigenous people in the Brazilian hinterland around Sao Paulo in early years, where they were pretty ruthlessly subject to enslavement by early colonists as well too. So there's some good literature on that. So I'll be teaching indigenous history, mostly in the so-called colonial period, focusing on those three areas. That history's always been embedded in my colonial Latin American history, but this brings it out, puts it front and center. So that's new. In terms of research projects, there are aspects of the current Salvador project which I will probably pursue independently, either independent of the project, either with Professor Krause or independently, including global tobacco trade, which is a really interesting story because Brazilian tobacco goes everywhere, including to the Qing court, where it's purchased in the form of snuff and very coveted as well. But it's all over the Indian Ocean, all over Africa. Yeah, it's a really interesting commodity chain. So history of drugs, basically.
That's a fun one.
Yeah. Well, drugs made the early modern economy go round. It's crazy. It's all drugs.
We're going to bring it home with a quick 5 questions that are just no thinky, just whatever comes to your head first. Very simple questions. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right. Do you have a favorite book?
Let's start over again. You should know the answer to that. But then I always think, do I want to mention a history book? Do I want to mention
If it helps, others have mentioned history books as their favorite.
Okay, Sugar and the Formation of Brazilian Society by Stuart Schwartz.
Do you have a favorite food?
I'm a cook, so it's very hard for me to do favorite food. But I'll say Mediterranean peasant food.
Your favorite non-work activity?
Singing or gardening.
What is your favorite thing to do in New York City?
Walk around, especially neighborhoods with like older buildings like Lower Broadway.
And the final question, what is your favorite type of music?
Classical music, largely conceived. So everything from Renaissance to contemporary classical music.
That's wonderful. That's all of our questions. Thank you so much, Professor Ebert. This was a ton of fun. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. It was extremely informative, and I'm kind of sad I'm graduating this semester and I don't get to sign up for a class next semester with you.
Sorry, you're not going to be in one. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Our Professor podcast was recorded with the permission of the Brooklyn College History Department and our student interviewees. We would like to thank both the students and faculty for their contributions.